Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more of Warhammer 40k lore. Today's subject is Gabriel Seth, the current day chapter master of the Flesh Terrors, one of the most loathed, feared, and thoroughly reviled chapters in the Imperium, but also one of the most necessary. We'll talk about the chapter itself and its history in next week's video, but for now, let's return to the badass-in-chief, Gabriel Seth, a man that kicks so much ass he had it inscribed on his favorite kicking boot. A man that was summoned to a tribunal by his fellow Blood Angels chapter masters, condemned, found guilty, and just about to be sentenced to exile and death, and yet still he stared them down and called them all pussies. A man that invaded the home of Astaroth the Grim, one of the most feared fighters in the entire galaxy, and beat the shit out of him for having overstepped his bounds in executing some of his Death Company members. And not enough with that, he even threatened to come back for a second round if Astaroth was to do it again, before limping just as bloodied and bruised as Astaroth back to his Thunderhawk. And perhaps most impressively of all, he is a blood angel that dares to hope for the future. Now, a positive outlook on tomorrow is a rarity in and of itself in the 41st millennium, but for a blood angel successor chapter, the odds seems further than most. All descendants of Sanguinius suffer to some degree from the curse, the Black Rage and the Red Thirst, but the Flesh Terrors suffer from it even worse than most, to the point that they are losing battle brothers to the Rage quicker than they can even replenish their own ranks. It got so bad that by the time Gabriel Seth assumed the mantle of Chapter Master, there were barely 200 sane Flesh Terrors left in the entire chapter. Heavy emphasis on the sane part there, by the way. That's one of the secrets and quirks of the Flesh Terrors chapter that we'll get into in the next video. Gabriel Seth's fresh command, then, was in all due reality less of a chapter and more of a pair of reinforced companies with some scout elements, and with precious little, if any, hope of ever growing beyond these numbers again. Seth found himself in a most unenviable position, and one that had led many of the preceding chapter masters down a dark and irreversible path of hopelessness, pessimism, and despair, whilst yet others clung desperately to the idea that their original founding chapter master, Nazir Ahmed, that the chapter's newly founded homeworld of Cretaceous would somehow provide a solution to their curse. Nazir had seen something of his own nature, and that of his chapter, in this ungodly death world, and thought therefore that it might provide the solution to their problems. But over 10,000 years later, Cretaceous has yet to make good on its promise. Instead of wallowing in despair, or hoping that some millennia-old idea had finally come to fruition then, Gabriel Seth decided on a new path. The galaxy did not appear over-eager to provide his chapter with any salvation whatsoever, and if it was then his and his beloved chapter's destiny to go forever into darkness, then by the God Emperor, he would at least make their ending a glorious one. Gabriel Seth set out to redeem his chapter, to mend their fraying reputation, and place them up amongst the Emperor's angels, so that they might be remembered as glorious warriors and protectors of humanity rather than bloodthirsty barbarian mongrels. And the first step Seth would take on this path was to attempt to repair his and his chapter's relationships with the other successors of the Blood Angels. And so he went directly to the source, the chapter master of the Blood Angels' first founding chapter, Dante. The legendary Golden Warrior personified everything it meant to be a Blood Angel: nobility, honor, and the aspect of the angel, the closest thing the galaxy has ever come to the vision of Sanguinius Reborn. To this avatar of the Blood Angels, Gabriel Seth promised to do everything in his power to restrain the excesses of his brethren, to keep in check the more berserk aspects of their nature, and to redeem their honor. This was a supreme gesture of conciliation from the fresh chapter master, and an admittance of sorts of the misdeeds of the chapter. A first brave step on a long and thorny path to redemption, as the Flesh Terrors had not merely alienated their Blood Angels' brethren, their reputation had spread so far and wide and become so dark as to see other Astartes chapters straight out refuse to cooperate with the Flesh Terrors. Even those of the same founding legion were very hesitant to offer their aid to the Flesh Terrors' cause. And not merely because they were worried that the Flesh Terrors might turn upon their new allies as they had done before, blinded by bloodthirst, but because of the taint to their reputation should they choose to willingly associate themselves with a chapter that has had many members of the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition argue for investigations at the least, and full-out purges at the most. And the young, bright-eyed, and bushy-tailed chapter master would soon come to realize just how difficult of a task he had set for himself. It was all well and good to rush off to the Blood Angels as his first official action, and promise that he would do better than his predecessors. It was another matter entirely to make good on those promises. Gabriel Seth himself, after all, was no stranger to the lure of the Black Rage, wielding an enormous two-handed chainsword, a relic eviscerator bearing the name of Blood Reaver, its chains having been taken from Chapter Master Nasir Ahmet's dual chain fists, is a weapon every bit as brutal, gory, grim, and unsubtle as the Chapter Master himself. And his impact upon the enemy was once described by Chapter Master Dante as the equivalent of a battle cannon shell, albeit potentially even bloodier and certainly more lethal. And the similarities between Gabriel Seth and a battle cannon shell don't end there either. Both are rather blunt instruments, and neither care over much about the collateral damage left in their wake, at least so long as there's no one there to observe it. And I'm not joking. Gabriel Seth's secret weapon in repairing the ramshackle reputation of his chapter is quite simply to ensure that there are no witnesses to their more excessive acts of violence. Now, misunderstand me correctly here, I am not saying that the Flesh Terrors simply disappear anyone so unfortunate as to see them in the midst of their work. Although, that has certainly happened as well. Instead, Gabriel Seth goes to great lengths to ensure that his flesh tearers are the first on scene, and that they wrap up any fighting long before external observers arrive. By doing this, Gabriel Seth can ensure that the only thing that remains after the fighting is done, and his flesh tearers are already gone, is a grateful populace, telling tales of the majestic angels that descended from the heavens, smashed their enemies, and then zoomed on off again before they could get to massacring the civilian population. But that last part is usually left out, of course. And to the average Imperial civilian, one Space Marine looks an awful lot like another, so the Flesh Tearers' somewhat shoddy reputation rarely get in the way of glowing reviews from those that they have now saved. In order to further this highly specialized strategy, Seth has all of the librarians of the Flesh Tearers Librarius constantly seeking in the ether for any and all distress messages, almost regardless of how small, how irrelevant, or how far away it is. The Flesh Tearers have been known to operate in 2 segmentums, which is a tremendous area of space to cover. And yet, the very specific circumstances that the Flesh Tearers require may often need a fair bit of travelling. And searching, for that matter. After all, there's only a couple companies of Flesh Tearers left. There's a limit to the kind of threat that they can quash quickly. So what they are looking for specifically is a threat in the very dawning days of its creation, an orc warg that has just started hitting Imperial space. It has barely gotten off its home rock at this point and is only made up of perhaps a dozen or so tribes. This is absolutely a threat to companies of Space Marines, particularly ones as ferocious as the Flesh Tearers can deal with quickly and decisively. Another fan favorite is uprisings and rebellions, a local Imperial world that has underestimated the scale and scope of local cult activity, for example. Once more, the Flesh Tearers can come barreling onto the scene like a small nuclear warhead, level a hive city or two, and then whoosh on again before the locals even realize what the hell just hit them. And as they're busy picking over the corpses, well, one mutilated civilian looks an awful lot like a heretic cultist, doesn't he? Particularly after having been wrung through the teeth of a Flesh Tearer's chainsword. And Seth's plan is working. The Flesh Tearers may not have the kind of large-scale impacts upon galactic events that other chapters like the Ultramarines, the Space Wolves, or the Blood Angels themselves have, or even those of the later foundings, but that are still in possession of full chapter strength. But of course, having the greatest possible impact is not Gabriel Seth's first and foremost priority. It is the redemption of his chapter. And his surgical strikes, as surgical as a chainsaw will ever get, I suppose, has gone to considerable length in doing this. Many a world that only knew the Flesh Tearers through half-heard, shadowy and dark rumors, and used to fear them, now view them as their saviors. They have even begun to accumulate a rather unlikely reputation as the protectors of the weak, the downtrodden, and the ignored. If a small solar system containing perhaps a couple of populated worlds is under attack, the Imperium is not going to care. That is a local matter for local PDF forces. Imperial Guard reserves will not be mobilized. Space Marine chapters will most assuredly not be dispatched. The locals will be left to their own devices. And PDF troops can be of varying quality. A raid that would pose absolutely no threat whatsoever to a main system might lead to devastation and genocide on many other worlds. Only the flesh terrors seem to be willing to be bothered with these, by the standards of the galaxy, minor skirmishes. But do not make the mistake of thinking that Gabriel Seth is purely cynical in this regard, and willfully ignores the needs of the wider Imperium to focus on his own personal goals. He is willing to recognize that sometimes the needs of the Imperium must take precedence. Additionally, there is assuredly an advantage to being seen alongside more prestigious and disciplined chapters, many of which may have heard the same unfortunate rumors about the flesh tearers as aforementioned civilians. And if they then manage to operate cordially in the same area, maybe that the flesh tearer's reputation would improve simply by having fought alongside the established venerated chapters. That is, of course, assuming that everything goes according to plan. One war in which Seth set apart the needs of his chapter in favor of the needs of the Imperium was the Third War for Armageddon. Dozens of chapters had been called upon to face down a third invasion of the monstrous greenskin warlord Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka. This would be war on a planetary scale. There would be massive pitched battles across the rolling wastes of Armageddon. They would be void of warfare, and the flesh tearers would be expected to operate alongside not only thousands of fellow Astartes, but millions of Imperial Guard troops and Sisters of Battle elements as well. The flesh tearers needed to be on their best behavior, and for situations precisely like this, Gabriel Seth had come up with a new way for the flesh tearers to operate. Essentially, a miniaturized version of their segmentum-sized strategy. The flesh tearers would keep to themselves aboard their warships. They would make camp a suitable distance from all other loyalist forces. And they would also make sure that whenever the inevitable need to communicate with other troops arose, it would be nice and safe in the rearward lines, where a flesh tearer could demonstrate to the outsiders that they could be every bit as noble and controlled a chapter as the valued blood angels. And when it came to fighting, they would strike at the enemy's rear lines. They would engage in small hit-and-run operations, shaving off portions of the larger enemy force, cutting away at them here and there, intercepting supply convoys, raiding campsites, etc. They grew so adept at this terror tactic role that even the orcs grew scared of them, nicknaming them the Eaters of the Dead. And on certain instances, the orcs would actually outright withdraw from the battlefield if they were faced with flesh tearers, which... That's high praise right there. When the orcs won't even fight you, you're doing something right. Unfortunately, the flesh tearers' substantial and good contribution to the Third War for Armageddon were all absolutely overshadowed by a single unfortunate incident. The flesh tearers were deployed in the fire wastes of Armageddon, vast, desolate, lethal plains of ash and soot, often ravaged by lethal storms. Only Astartes or fully power-armored humans like the Sisters of Battle would be able to operate in impunity in these areas where even the orcs found the living to be a bit on the harsh side. Couple this with low visibility caused by frequent vast ash storms, you have pretty much the ideal operating conditions for a chapter like the Flesh Tearers that like to get up close and personal with the enemy. but it was during one incident where a large contingent of Orc artillery pieces and their accompanying forces had laid siege to a small imperial settlement that catastrophe struck. The settlement was called Gaia's Point, and the citizens, used to the harsh climates and undoubtedly frequent raids by those who always seemed to find a living out in the wastes preying upon others, had formed an irregular militia to defend themselves against the Orc invaders. The brave civilian defenders were also aided by a formation of Sisters of Battle of the Order of the Argent Shroud. The Flesh Terrors saw this as an excellent opportunity to do what they do best: save and protect the innocent and the weak. Quite a twist for a chapter with such an ominous name, but that is the ideal that Gabriel Seth wishes the chapter to live up to. The Flesh Terrors deployed directly behind the Orcs' gunnery positions, stormed into them, and began shredding the Greenskins apart into rivulets of black blood and flying green flesh. Their intentions was to cause the maximum amount of panic and fear amongst the Orcs and drive them away from their battery positions and straight on to the hammering bolters of the Sisters of Battle. That part of the plan worked out excellently. The Orcs were caught in between two indomitable forces. To their front, the Sisters were keeping up an interminable barrage of lethally precise bolter fire. The civilian militia also joined in from amongst their houses at Gaia's Point, firing whatever weapons they had out at the milling Orcs, streaming around in abject confusion, as there was no pulling back either, since from that direction all that could be heard was the screams of dying Orcs and the roaring of chain blades. And soon, through the drifting ash clouds, the figures of red and black armored space marines could be seen by the civilian defenders as they slaughtered the unholy Xenos invaders. They must have appeared as if titans of myths to the civilians, the very essence of the avenging angels come to scour the Xenos threat from their planet. But as the last Orc fell, carved into a dozen pieces by roaring chainswords, the angels didn't stop coming. The Sisters of Battle could only stand by aghast and horrified as the Flesh Terrors slammed into the civilian irregulars and butchered them to the last man and woman. Aghast at what they were seeing, yet reluctant to engage their allies, the Sisters of the Order of the Argent Shroud could only retreat, lest they also fall victim to the Flesh Terror's madness. Obviously, they reported the incident to the Inquisition immediately, and this was the closest the Flesh Terrors ever came to being outright declared excommunicatus traitoris, the ultimate sanction that would reduce the Flesh Terrors to the status of a renegade chapter, which all other Astartes and Imperial forces were honor-bound to kill on sight. And only a minor miracle of diplomacy prevented the worst possible outcome. But Gabriel Seth's hope to improve the standing of his chapter in the eyes of his brother Space Marines was thoroughly crushed. And whilst the ultimate sanction had just barely been avoided, this was not the first run-in with the Inquisition that the Flesh Terrors or Seth had had. And his fellow chapter masters were beginning to worry that despite the Flesh Terrors' somewhat improving reputation, they were becoming far too much of a liability, to the point that a special conclave was called, a trial of blood, where Chapter Master Gabriel Seth was sent the summons to the trial, where if he did not appear before the gathered chapter masters of the various Blood Angel successor chapters, they would come and hunt him and his chapter down themselves. They would do what the Inquisition had threatened to do if he did not appear. Not having much choice in the matter, Gabriel Seth acquiesced and travelled to Baal to stand trial before his fellow chapter masters, where he was accused of a laundry list of misdeeds, of which the Armageddon incident was merely the drop of blood that made the Grail flow over, including another rather extreme incident. A Inquisitor had waylaid the Flesh Tearers and had demanded to be let aboard their flagship. But instead of going to meet Gabriel Seth directly, which is what he was demanding, he sent a double to talk with the chapter master, whilst the Inquisitor himself infiltrated the lower deck areas of the flagship, where he came across the chapter's greatest secret. The fact that instead of granting their brothers lost to the Black Rage, their Death Company berserkers, the Emperor's mercy at the end of a campaign, like the other successor chapters, the Flesh Tearers kept them, bound them in iron and steel shackles and solid ceramite on their ships. And he was one of these lost brothers that the Inquisitor came across. Were it not for the actions of a chaplain who discovered and beat the Inquisitor senseless, taking him prisoner, that would have been the end of the Flesh Tearers right there. There would have been no explaining that away, none whatsoever. But instead of killing the Inquisitor, which is a worrying prospect in and of itself if the Flesh Tearers were even willing to consider going to such lengths, Seth hooked the Inquisitor up to an arcane device that allowed him to share the consciousness of one of the lost Black Company brothers. A few seconds was all it took to nearly break the Inquisitor's mind irreversibly, but he was disconnected before he went completely mad. Seth had wanted to teach the Inquisitor a lesson, to give him a little bit of perspective on what it is the Flesh Tearers have to deal with every day. And then he simply let him go. And instead of reporting the Flesh Tearers, the Inquisitor resigned his Rosarius, having had all faith, apparently, in his own judgment shattered by the visions shown to him by the Flesh Tearers chapter master. Playing with fire is putting it mildly. The trial did not go well for Gabriel Seth, as he also bandied insults with his judges. A wise move right there. Gabriel is a headstrong and proud individual, brash, bullish, and blunt to the point of it being a failing. He does not get along well with others, and he was condemned near universally. Even Dante, after having asked Gabriel if he had forgotten the promise he had made to him, to which Gabriel simply said that he had remembered it and he had strived every waking moment of his life to fulfill it, Dante condemned him as well. And to be fair, Seth had not necessarily done an entirely flawless job in keeping his promise. The Flesh Tearers chapter was to be disbanded. Their remaining brothers would be scattered amongst the other successors' chapters. Their names would be stricken from the records in dishonor, and Seth would remain on Baal until he either went insane or died. One out of the two. But Gabriel Seth received aid from a most unlikely source. Astorath the Grim, the High Chaplain of the Blood Angels. The same Astorath that Gabriel had attacked and viciously beaten for having executed some of his brethren without his permission. A very, very unlikely advocate indeed. The assembled chapter masters immediately cried out that this was not his decision to make. He had no authority here, which Astaroth countered by stating that he was the only authority when it came to how to deal with the lost, those who had succumbed to the curse. That, in and of itself, would have been a strident condemnation of Gabriel, Seth, and his flesh terrors, but the High Chaplain was not done there. Gabriel Seth was reckless, a maddened berserker, a mongrel. But the Imperium, the Blood Angels, were fighting chaos, the eternal arch-enemy, and sometimes mongrels were necessary to fight a war against an enemy who had no limits, no morals, and no principles. In a war against such a foe, mongrels and reckless curs can be invaluable allies. And so it was that Seth was allowed to continue taking charge of his chapter, and continue to try and redeem it. Ever since, however, Seth had developed quite the dislike for the Blood Angels and their haughty ways, though fences were eventually mended again during another conclave. This time it was the Blood Angels asking for the help of the other successor chapters. The Blood Angels had taken an ungodly battering, and they were requesting the various successors to give them a portion of their own initiates with which to replenish the Blood Angels' ranks. Gabriel Seth was entirely against this. It was the Blood Angels' own haughty ways that had led them to condemnation, and he did not have any warriors to spare himself. But thanks to the timely intervention of Fabius Bile, the Chaos Space Marine Apothecary, and the unleashing of several monstrous abominations upon Baal, saw the two chapter masters mend their ways in honorable combat against unspeakable monstrosities. The fact that the monstrosities were a product of Dante's mistake, well, that just made it all the sweeter when Gabriel Seth could stand up before the conclave and say that he would aid his brothers in making up for their error. I'm sure as friendly as he and Dante had gotten at the time, it probably was quite tasty to lord it over the Lord of Angels just a little bit. And now, in the modern timeline, after the devastation of Baal, Gabriel Seth should be a rather happy lad, shouldn't he? His flesh terrors are no longer on the brink of annihilation due to the curse of the Black Rage. His ranks are back to full chapter strength thanks to the Primaris Space Marines, generously donated by Reboot Gilliman. Yet, Gabriel is not really all that trusting of the Ultra Smurfs' gifts, describing the Primaris Marines as nothing more than Ultramarines in red power armor. Yet, despite this, because GW demanded it, there are now Primaris Flesh Terrors, just like there's Primaris Dark Angels. God, I hate the Primaris Marines. Loathe them, I do. But anyway, that is where Gabriel Seth's story ends so far. Hopefully, we will hear more from the chattest of chapter masters eventually. And hopefully, that future story will involve him carving his way through a series of chaos-mutated Primaris Marines. Hey, a man can hope, can't he? Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.